basis of what we're doing here, and as Rob mentioned, the work I've been doing in the last year has really been a large focus on sort of your question is, what do we do with the ones that are already here and need a place for them to go? How are we working with the shelters? How are we equipping sanctuaries? What can we really do to take care of the situation that we've created for ourselves? And so what I want to do in going through a talk on changing the captive bird paradigm really is skip over a little bit about me, other than the fact that I am a full-time practicing veterinarian. I am board certified in avian medicine and surgery, and it's what I do. This is me every day. I am lucky that I get to spend my day, every day of the week that I'm at work, dealing with these amazing animals. I love birds. I think they're great. I think they're amazing. I also think they belong in the wild, and that's a bit of what we're going to talk about here. People have often asked me at different seminars and lectures, well, how can you say that? You're an avian veterinarian. You spend your days in a practice working with these animals, trying to create health and make them well. How can you sit there and then say you wouldn't recommend people keep them as pets, or you'd like to see that? And my honest answer is, I could change professions. I mean, I literally feel that strongly at this point in my career that if that's what it took, I'd have to find something else to do. But I would gladly trade that if I didn't have to be like this every night. And so basically working through this discussion, we're going to get a little bit into why I feel this way, why a lot of you, based on different backgrounds of people here, working in shelters, working in sanctuaries, and trying to make the world a better place, often find ourselves crying ourselves to sleep every night. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer before we get into the crux of this. This information is really about parrots and pet birds. Information about wildlife, definitely we want to contact licensed wildlife rehabilitators. There's a link here as well for those of you that work in shelters and those of you that may be experiencing the issues relating to how bird and pet relinquishment has become a burden on shelters. Avian Welfare Coalition at that website has put together an amazing guide, which I've authored a couple chapters on, caring for birds in shelters. There's also links to some webinars and some information online. And then the last part are people who are working in sanctuaries or looking to start those or gain accreditation and actually run your sanctuary properly. The Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries has some great information on their website as well. I don't work for any of those organizations. I don't endorse in any way. I help them. And I help them because I do for them what I do here, which is try to introduce some concepts, try to educate people, and try and get the word out about what we're doing. The bottom line here is really the goal of my lecture. How do we focus on solutions? What can we do really? We know what the problems are. I'm going to talk about the problems. Clifford talked about the problems. Many of you are experiencing them every day. But how do we really just shift this paradigm? And one way to do that is really think about what are the solutions, not just the problems. And so I'm going to cover a lot of different things in this lecture. Any one of these different categories could easily be a day's set of discussions on its own, a week set. And so I want to just touch on some of the key points on some of these topics. We're going to talk a little bit about some basic facts. We're going to spend a bulk of the time on concepts of avian welfare. I do want to discuss and introduce how we look at suitability of an animal as a pet, how we can decide the right way to educate ourselves and look into whether they should be kept as pets. And then we'll go into the issues of what we deal with birds. And then the second part of the discussion is going to be a little bit more veterinary medicine based, not necessarily disease and that type of thing, but a bit more of hands-on working with and dealing with birds. Some of that comes through some of the shelter work we've been doing. And then I'll conclude my lecture by introducing some concepts of quarantine. And I think it's important just to touch on that. I think it's something that's largely overlooked. I think it's something that we don't think about. People don't have reason to think about that. They decide they want a new puppy and they just go and they bring it home and it's instantly part of the family. And I think people don't realize the potential for that. I'll touch a tiny bit on zoonosis. We've heard a little bit about some of those diseases as well. And then we'll get through this lecture that way. So some general information about pet birds, and I may be preaching to the choir, but the main point of this is they are the largest population of captive wildlife. And I think with my first slide, I think that first sentence says a lot. Captive wildlife. We have to accept and believe that. These animals are wild animals. They don't belong in our homes. Unfortunately, millions and millions and millions of them are. So let's move towards that. Birds are considered the fourth most popular companion animal. Dogs and cats and fish generally top those charts. You saw some data in the UK as well. There are about 352 species of birds, free-living birds in the world. The main point is whether they are captive bred or whether they are wild caught, the physical and behavioral needs of these animals are difficult to give them in captivity. They maintain those needs. We basically have a difficult time meeting those needs. As most of you know, birds lack color dimorphism, so we can't look at most of these parrot species and determine the gender just visually looking at them. Fortunately, other birds of their species can and do it quite well, but we're not able to do that. Birds generally exhibit what we call a flight or fright response. In the wild, they generally would rather leave. When confronted with a bad situation, they would rather avoid it. They generally don't fight with each other. They don't have the situations where living in large flocks and living with large groups. Generally the goal is, okay, this is the branch I'm on, you want it, I'll either peck you once and you'll leave, or I'll leave. It's just their preference. They'd rather leave the situation, but what happens when they're in a closed environment, the way almost all wild animals react, they have no choice but to show aggression. And this is an unfortunate part of it because that's what starts perpetuating the myths and some of the rumors we know about birds. You also hear a lot about birds as being animals that tend to mask illness or mask injury. People often talk about how they hide their illnesses until it's too late. And I will touch a little bit more about that, and I'll give you sort of my veterinarian thought on that. But I think a lot of that comes from the fact that birds are very sensitive creatures. I think birds are very aware when something is wrong. Birds understand in themselves if something isn't right, and it really takes a perceptive owner, and it really takes a person to really recognize early on enough when something is wrong. And like I said, we'll touch a little bit more on that and some of these other key points as well. Unpredictability of wild animals kept as pets, of course, is a huge problem. Birds are very intelligent. I was lucky the last few years I've worked with and been able to speak at seminars that have been conducted with Irene Pepperberg. Many of you have heard of her. She does a lot of research. She's famous for the work she did with Alex, the African gray that died a few years ago. But there is a group in New Jersey that has a fundraiser every year and hosts her to give a talk, and they've invited me several times to speak as well. But her latest research has actually confirmed that a lot of these pet birds have the cognitive abilities of a 5-year-old human child, which is really quite advanced for what we've given them credit for and what we expect from an animal that is put in a cage and ignored largely for the bulk of the day. So, life expectancy, of course, in birds. We know these are some of the most longest lived pets that people are going to keep. That sets up another important consideration in both adoption, in placement, in rehoming. And we have to be aware that they often can outlive their owners. Birds have very high metabolic rates. As an animal, they exist by being able to obtain enough calories in the day. There are even some species of birds that need to eat a certain percentage of body weight in calories each day in order to be able to wake up the next day. So they have a very high metabolic rate. They need to have these needs met, which becomes another challenge in captivity. One thing we don't routinely do is spay and neuter pet birds. Certainly the move with dogs and cats has been routine spay and neuter. We've morphed that into what we've needed to do with pet rabbits and a lot of the other animals that it's possible to do it on. But we don't offer that as something that would probably, I hate to say it, but would probably improve the ability to keep birds as pets. And I don't know if that's something we'll see in the near future. It's not something that we do right now. Most of the time, if we're attempting these procedures, they're medically based, and that's the reason that we're doing them. Birds do represent the group of wild animals that are the most threatened, and they have the most endangered species than any other families of birds. What I meant is parrots. Parrots represent that group. Because of the wildlife trade, because of trafficking, because of illegal trapping, we do see that parrots have the largest number of endangered species amongst the bird world. And unfortunately, there aren't a lot of legal protections for them. This is something that we've talked about earlier, and this is something that a lot of the people's questions so far have been guided to. Well, why can't we stop it? You know, there was a question, how do we get people to not want to buy this animal? And how do we change people's ideas and their mentality? And I guess part of it are baby steps and the ways that we're working through even events like this, or even larger scale events. But part of it's going to have to be legislation. Part of it's going to have to be changing the laws. Part of it is going to have to be what we're talking about, changing the entire paradigm of what we believe is appropriate for animals, what we believe is the right way to care for them, what we feel is the most appropriate way to actually attempt to keep these animals in captivity, barring the fact that I don't think we're going to decide that we don't want to do that. And the commonly kept parrot species, most of you are familiar with these. The passerine species, our canaries, our finches. The psittacine species, everything from the small budgerigars and cockatiels through a whole variety of conure species up into the larger macaws and cockatoos. And then people are definitely keeping the pigeons and doves. I'm from New York City. We have a large population of pigeons. We have a large population of people who seem to have an affinity for pigeons, and we have a wildlife hospital that opened up recently in New York City, the first wildlife hospital that pretty much is 98% pigeon work. So people definitely have them, care for them, and keep them. And then we have a portion of what we consider to be wildlife. Although I would lump parrots in with wildlife, we're talking about truly those people who find an injured wild bird, don't have the heart to have it euthanized because it's not releasable, and decide that it will either live with them or they'll find a place for it to go. That in itself could be the topic of a whole series of lectures. And there was another question that was brought up earlier as well. What do you do with them when there's nowhere for them to go? And this represents a huge problem, and I'll touch a little bit on that bird-oriented as we progress through as well. Sorry for such a morbid picture, but I think it kind of summarizes a little bit of what we're talking about. A good friend of mine that runs a parrot sanctuary, one that I consider probably one of the better parrot sanctuaries in this country, told me this quote recently when we were dealing with some issues about birds, and I think we all probably realize that when you give your soul to help the helpless, something that we're all doing, you definitely open your heart to a lot of pain. And there's a lot of pain that we experience in dealing with this. Working in shelters and dealing with pet overpopulation, dealing with any species, the focus here being birds, but dealing with what we've created in this conundrum of what we've done with animals, both in zoos, the interest in issues related to marine mammals, the increased interest for avian welfare is what's sort of recharging a lot of people's batteries, and it is sort of a breath of fresh air. There's a larger concern that I think we're showing for animals. I think we're seeing that by us being here in this room. I think we're seeing this paradigm in a lot of different ways. The issues with the awareness that even something like Blackfish has raised about the issues with SeaWorld and captive marine mammals. We're seeing a lot more people paying a lot more attention to the concern for animals in captivity, and I think that's largely because we have a better understanding of their behavior. We know a bit more about their biology. As Clifford has mentioned, we're seeing an increase in the number of scientific publications. We're seeing more interest in journals wanting information on ethnobiology and how these animals exist and what they need to keep them happy and what we can do to provide that. The problem with pet birds, sort of the crux of this lecture, and I think I'll say that probably 18 more times, is that significant aspects of their behavior become denied in captivity. And what happens when that happens is a whole backlash of problems. Birds are geared to do a number of specific things, and then we find that we don't allow them to do that. Well, what do we expect is going to happen? This is a big issue that we'll touch on a little bit later in the discussion when we look at self-destructive behaviors, when an animal that should be in a flock is now living alone. And that's just only one example. The loss of flight I mean, birds fly. It's sort of the most amazing thing about them. And I have a slide that we'll come to that basically says they fly, it's what they do. It's what makes them birds. It's something they should be doing. They need to be doing it. Yet in 70% of homes, they're unable to fly. Or flight is something where they get to circle the room once or twice. As well as the effects of a wild animal needing to propagate its species. And I think this is probably one of the biggest problems that I deal with. Issues, behavioral problems, medical problems that are all related to reproduction. These birds have a drive. They want to find a mate, they want to build a nest, they want to lay some eggs, they want to raise a family, and they want to repeat that. Well, that's one of the biggest things that gets denied to them in captivity. And so what happens? Once again, undesirable behaviors. What happens with undesirable behaviors? I don't want it in my home anymore, and that leads to a bigger problem. So we get into these issues of having both serious welfare concerns, and then we get into issues related to conservation issues. The illegal bird trade, the illegal wildlife trade has become a huge problem. We're going to touch a little bit more about that. What I want to talk about first is really going through the concepts of how do we determine when a companion animal is a suitable pet? What are the ways that we can sort of less emotionally look at that? How can we scientifically, how can we logically come up with a system that allows us to do that? This is some of the earlier work that people have done that has kind of filtered in and stayed in the background of a lot of people's minds. Shipley and Fraser developed this framework of how do you categorize an animal based on its certain unique characteristics that would tell us whether it's suitable as a pet. And what's interesting, and I found when I was doing some of the research for this talk today, is the basis of why they wrote this up actually comes from here in Toronto, the early issues in the 90s about keeping potbelly pigs as pets. And apparently that became a huge topic, and there was a desire to find a more appropriate way to determine whether an animal should be considered appropriate to keep as a pet. And they developed this system where they looked at three main criteria, and it's a bit overly simplified, but number one is the welfare of the animal. Are we enhancing their lives by keeping them in our homes? The welfare of others, other humans, other animals, who they are affected upon, do they improve the owner's life? And the third was the welfare of the environment, and we have to consider whether there is potential harm to the environment by keeping these animals. They further went on to develop 5 categories that pets would fall into, categories A through E, where category A would be those that are most suited to be pets, and category E would be those that probably should not be kept as pets. And then they worked into this the 5 freedoms, which many of you may have heard of. I'm going to touch on those as well. But the 5 freedoms are part of this assessment as well. And it provides a bit of a rational way to work through whether we think birds should be kept as pets. The first one of those is the welfare of the animal. And what we need to look at is there adequate knowledge of the species to feed it properly, to keep it in our homes, to provide the right type of environment? Can we provide everything they need for exercise, for social interaction? Once again, the crux of it being, can we allow them to exhibit their natural behaviors while in captivity? Well, we've seen some evidence already this morning that it's not happening with reptiles, and obviously we strongly believe it's not happening with birds as well. But if we were able to do that, if we could cross off the list that we knew how to feed them and we knew how to provide the right environment, we were doing everything they needed for them to meet their behavioral and social needs, is there still adequate knowledge, and would the owners still have difficulty doing it? So just because we know how to feed them, is there difficulty doing it? Is there difficulty accessing veterinary care? Do we have the means to find ways for these animals to get the right care? And of course, these are 2 big topics because we may know how to feed an animal, but it doesn't necessarily mean people are doing it. And this is something that I see as a practicing veterinarian. When a client comes in and they've adopted an insectivorous reptile, but they don't like bugs. So they don't want them in the house, and they want to come up with another way to take care of it. It's the same thing with those people that want to feed a carnivore or a vegan diet. You know, these things just don't work, and it creates a huge challenge. So we have to also consider, is there a challenge in providing an environment that will meet the animal's physical needs? And I think this is getting into a deeper topic. We have to consider the animal size. And we know that people keep pet birds, everything from a small canary or a finch that may weigh 12 to 13 grams, all the way up to the large parrots, a hyacinth macaw, may be coming in at a kilogram, even more. So is the animal size going to be a problem? Are they going to reach an adult size and we can't keep them anymore? Always making links back to this morning, of course, that's a huge problem with snakes. That's been a huge problem with the issues in the Florida Everglades, where we saw a slide of the release of the Burmese pythons. People would adopt these animals when they're small, and then many years later they are much, much bigger. There is no longer a tank that can contain them. They decide they don't want to devote an entire room in their home. So where can they, what do they do with the animal? The question asked before, they put them out the door. Good luck. Let them go out in the wild. Is there also a problem with them being so small? And unfortunately, that's a problem as well. I hate more than anything to see situations where a client brings me in a pet that they've stepped on, that they've sat on. There seems to be people who choose to take their pets and sleep in bed with them, birds and reptiles, and they can easily roll over on them and crush them and kill them that way as well. So is that a factor to consider? The third one is the life expectancy. We know that a lot of these birds are living long lives. What do we also know? They don't live as long as they should. And this is a common problem as well. I love when clients come in, they've just spent $2,000 on this brand new baby macaw, and they love the idea that they're going to have this animal 80 or 90 years. Unfortunately, it's a higher likelihood that they'll be rehoming it in 3 years, but if they actually make the commitment to keep it, huge problems that we've seen in other animals, and we've already touched on this morning. The breeding of color mutations, the breeding of genetically inferior animals has led to just that. When you breed for color, you're not controlling for other things. And we don't have a move to breed for longevity. We don't breed animals for cancer resistance. We don't breed animals for lower likelihoods of developing kidney failure. We breed them for pretty colors. And that's often the problem, is we're not getting longevity out of them. And I'm forced to tell somebody, no, we don't see that. Yes, your bird should live 100 years. Even if it lives out its lifespan in captivity, if we get it to 50, I'll be thrilled. And that's an unfortunate part of it. The reality of that as well is these animals that should live 80 or 90 years are developing cancer at 12 years old. Their livers are shutting down at 15. Their kidneys stop working when they're 20. And somebody is sitting there saying, well, I thought they lived 60 years. Well, it's an unfortunate part of what we're doing by keeping them. Certainly it's multifactorial. Also, is there an appreciable risk of suffering, illness, or death arising from procurement of these animals and transportation? Of course there is. We know that there is. We've touched on that, and I'll touch a bit more when I go through a little bit of information on conservation and captive breeding and all of our attempts to try and circumvent that. But we know that's a huge problem. I recently read some new statistics about the African gray parrot importation, the legal capture of wild African grays to send them from Africa to disseminate them out has, no surprise to anybody, about a 58% mortality rate. So in order for them to meet their quota of sending 2,500 live birds, they trap 5,000 to 6,000 because they know half of them are going to die. We see those same numbers and even worse numbers with the reptiles and with a lot of other wild-caught animals. But I guess I just can't wrap my mind around somebody whose mentality is, well, half of them are going to die, so let me go out and take 5,000 baby birds from nests because I hope I can get 2,000 to survive when I get them through the United States or Europe or wherever else they're going through. So we know that's a huge problem in considering welfare. Fortunately, number 5 is not an issue in our pet birds. They're not poisonous or venomous. I had a client come in recently and ask me to advise them on adopting a cobra. So it's the kind of thing where in my world, I kind of look at them and I just want to say, get out. You know, we're not even going to have this conversation. But there's been a rise in people's desire to own venomous snakes. And I know somebody who recently went to a reptile show in Pennsylvania and they were selling venomous snakes to anybody that had enough money to buy them, regardless of who they were. We don't have to worry about that with birds. They may not have venom, but their bite is certainly going to be along the lines of being quite difficult. Is there a risk of the animal attacking or hurting humans and other animals? Of course there is. We know that's a huge problem. Aggression becomes one of the bigger reasons that people want to get rid of any type of pet they have in their home. If that risk of injury exists, can we make it acceptably low by selecting safe individuals? Well, it doesn't happen with wild animals. It's a fact that it just doesn't work that way. Have we tried to work with breeding out aggression in certain breeds of dogs? Yes. Have we had the opportunity over thousands and thousands of years of trying to selectively breed for certain traits that we want and desire? Yes. We don't have that option with birds. They're a generation or two removed from the wild. They're not even close to being domesticated as pets. So we don't have the option to do that. And of course, if a risk of disease transmission exists, which we'll talk about zoonotic disease, but we know that's a very real factor as well, can it be made acceptably low by finding individuals free from the disease? Well, that gets into a whole realm of people's willingness to take these animals to the vet, to pay for diagnostic testing, to work through the ability to determine if that's true or not. Now, one of the issues we deal with birds, of course, is do they have objectionable characteristics? Are they dirty? Are they smelly? Do they make a huge mess? Can they become unruly? Well, certainly wild animals and intact wild animals go through puberty. They reach sexual maturity. If they're alone, they would like a mate. They would like to figure out a way to make that happen. And every attempt to stop those behaviors, every attempt to control Mother Nature, to control hormonal urges is going to fail. It's going to result in that bird being either let out the window, dumped at a sanctuary, left on a doorstep, which happens to us unfortunately, or attempts to find a place for them to go. And it's a problem because we have to consider how that affects the owner, but how does that affect the community at large? It affects the community at large because of the issues we've talked about with where do these animals go? Now, does the animal have other characteristics that may cause an owner to lose interest in them, may cause an owner to lose their desire to take care of them? Well, unfortunately, the novelty wears off with a lot of pets. It's a huge problem with exotic pets in general. The small exotic mammals, pets that are bought for children, that people think is a kid's pet. They got the guinea pig for the 9-year-old. Well, guinea pigs can live 7 to 8 years. Well, that 9-year-old is now 10 or 11 or 12 and no longer has an interest in that pet anymore. So the whole concept of the novelty wearing off can become a problem. And anybody who's lived with large parrots knows that screaming, that becomes an issue at 5 o'clock in the morning. The mess, the throwing food, the attempts to bathe in the water bowls, all of the things that you deal with in having a pet living in your home causes people to reach a point where they just don't want to deal with it anymore. And why should we even start the process and have an animal move in that we're going to get sick of in a couple years? The third thing we look at is environmental risk. Is there an appreciable risk if the animal can cause ecological damage if it escapes or if it's released? Tying back to what we talked about earlier. Hopefully we don't have a large amount of these animals being released. I run into a situation a lot where people have this idea that Central Park in New York City is a wonderful park and it's a great home for animals that they no longer want. They actually believe that if they no longer want that rabbit, that they should release it in the park. They think they're doing a good thing for them. I think sometimes people think the same thing about birds as well, and I think that they're sadly mistaken in a lot of those situations. Now, we do have populations of wild parrots that have learned to thrive. We have a large population of Quaker parakeets, or the monk parakeets in New Jersey in the Edgewater area that have been there for about 35 years. It's believed, and there are rumors, that they escaped from importation through the airports. It's believed that they migrated up from escaped birds from Florida. Either way, these animals have figured out how to survive in a completely different environment, and they do it very well, to the point that they build these huge nests on power lines, and they build these huge nests in places where it becomes destructive to the environment. And what that means is the people who lose their electricity don't like that. The electric company has to come in, and all they do is knock the nest down, regardless of whether it's full of eggs or babies, or they try and get these animals to somebody that can take care of them. For any of you that have raised baby birds, starting at day 1 presents quite a challenge. For species that exist in the wild, are trade and transport subject to adequate regulation and enforcement? And of all of the ones we've talked about, this may be probably the most positive one. The the regulation of the interspecies transportation, the legal interspecies transportation, might be one of the areas where we sort of succeed. We have some rules in place. We have some very specific ways that people can take a pet bird on a plane, or a way that they can suddenly decide they're moving from Texas to Thailand and they want to take their parrots with them. So we do have some regulations in place and how we restrict that and how we control that. So we may be succeeding there. Now, number 12, if there's ongoing wild capture, which we certainly know there is there a risk that capture may have undesirable effects on native populations? Well, absolutely. We're destroying native populations. We are creating a situation where so many more of these animals are now endangered. I have a friend who was in private veterinary practice who has abandoned that for conservation work, and she now devotes her entire career towards working towards conservation of the macaws in Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua and some of the Central American countries. And she recently spoke at a conference, and I was really glad to hear her talk, because in some of these areas, they're approaching 100% poaching rate. They're actually going out there in the wild and finding that almost 100% of the chicks are stolen from the nests. There's no repopulation. There's no new birds being produced. Every baby bird that is born is being kidnapped and sold into the pet trade. There's not going to be a repopulation. Well, what happens? It's a downward spiral, and eventually you run out of birds and it becomes a huge problem. So certainly if that risk exists, can it be avoided by the use of captive breeding? Well, unfortunately, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but we've already alluded to the fact that captive breeding doesn't fix the problem either. There are people who thought that if we got more people that would breed pet birds in captivity, we could stop taking them from the wild. If we had more people that could successfully breed bearded dragons or any of these type of reptiles, then maybe we would decrease our demand for taking them from the wild, but we haven't found that to be the truth. And the unfortunate part of that is that as well is multifactorial. There's a lot of factors to consider in that, and a lot of issues of why these animals are still unfortunately taken from the wild. So pulling that all together, we're looking at suitability as a pet. The categories of animal species classified according to the degree of suitability are A through E. And to give you an idea, category A would have an animal like a pet hamster, where we pretty much believe that the animal is successfully captive bred, they're fairly easy to take care of. It's believed that when we're forced to have animals as pets, they're probably easy enough to take care of. Category B would be where our dogs and cats fit in. They do present some challenges, but for the most part, they're domesticated animals and they work really well in our society. Well, category E, the lowest one on there, are those species that are unsuitable as companion animals for any of the reasons that we've talked about so far. Undue harm or risk to one or more of the following. To that individual animal, that's probably the worst part of it. The damage, the mental incapacitation, whatever it is that we do, we're harming the animals. Damage to the owner, the community, or the environment. When we look at any of these, we lump those in category E, and unfortunately, this is the one that parrots fall into. So as a purist and somebody who believed in this category system and somebody who said, well, I base my decisions on what these authors have published and what they found, taking out emotion, we find that parrots really don't fit into a category that should make them meet this criteria to be considered suitable as pets. Of course, that doesn't change the fact that there are millions and millions and millions of them still in people's homes. So the 5 freedoms that were developed through the Farm Animal Welfare Council, they've been used to evaluate animal welfare for a number of different species. They're an important group and they're somewhat oversimplified, but they kind of cover everything we think an animal would need in captivity. Basically, they're freedoms from hunger, thirst, and malnutrition, freedoms from disease and injury acquired within captivity, freedom from physical and thermal discomfort, freedom from fear and any other negative psychological stresses that we could put on an animal being kept in captivity, and then freedom to carry out normal forms of behavior. Can we guarantee that an animal that we choose to keep as a pet, that we keep in a zoo or a sanctuary or any place they're kept outside of the wild, that we can provide these 5 freedoms to them. And I'm just going to go through a little bit of information about that, and basically looking at freedom from hunger. You know, typical bird cages provide places to give birds food and water. Owners are hyper vigilant about feeding their pets. If anything, most owners overfeed all of their pets. So it would seem that we could give birds the right food and water. Is it simple enough? No. Because we have to know the nutritional requirements of these animals, and that's just something we don't know yet. Dietary standards are fairly non-existent for almost all the parrot species that we keep as pets. 30 years ago, we developed diets for pet parrots based on how we thought chickens needed to be fed. We basically extrapolated information on what an appropriate diet is to raise a chicken, to either allow that chicken to lay enough eggs or to allow that chicken to become dinner for somebody. And then that's how we started feeding parrots. And over the last 10, 20 years, we've started morphing that more into our understanding of how these animals need to eat and what they need to be fed in captivity. Well, certainly the solution is learning the natural wild diet. The general sense of what a parrot eats in the wild is listed here. They spend the bulk of their day grazing and foraging for fruit and nuts and flowering plants and leaves, seeds, bark. There's some exceptions to some different animals. There are some birds that are highly frugivorous. The bulk of their diet becomes fruit. You wonder why those species kept in people's homes refuse to eat fruit. We have animals that are highly nectivorous. The bulk of their diet is nectar, yet they're being fed seed in people's homes. So we have to understand that there's a natural diet that we could make an attempt to mimic. What we can't do, unfortunately, is really mimic the diet of animals that feed on certain foods that are only available where they come from, that are only seasonally available, that are only there through certain times of the year. You know, the classic example that has been the macaws feeding on the palm nuts, and that's the exclusive part of their diet when that's available, and that's not something that we can replicate in captivity. And we can also work through and try to find the best quality bird foods, the best quality formulated seeds, the best quality formulated diets. Try and make an attempt to do that. Try to make sure that when we are trying to feed our pet birds, we put the biggest and best effort into nutrition. I think we found that nutrition is a huge factor in longevity, and we know that even for us, how we eat is a big factor in how our immune systems do and how we're going to survive. So there are ways to do this. And unfortunately, getting people to do it is the trickier part of it. You know, there are a number of people who say, I don't eat fruit, I don't buy fruit. They don't have a desire to then buy fruit for an animal that should be eating a lot of fruit. So it becomes a problem, but we have ways to work on it. What's healthy for people is healthy for birds. And a lot of times people ask me, in one sentence, how do I feed my pet bird? Well, high quality bird food and then healthy things you eat. Think along the lines of fruits and vegetables, whole foods, nuts, healthy foods like that are going to be what meets their nutritional requirements as best as what we know. Certainly variety is a key to meeting their nutritional needs. I'm less worried that they get every vitamin and mineral we think they need every day, and more concerned that they get it met through sort of the bigger picture, which is a lot of variety. And certainly we underestimate how often these birds need additional nutrients. An owner has a pet, it gets the same diet every day largely. Well, we forget that they go through different phases of life, growth, aging, geriatric years, reproduction. There are different aspects of when these birds may need additional nutrients. We're pretty good about understanding that. Somebody who's a dog breeder knows that that dog is lactating. She needs additional nutrients. We feed them that way. We're even pretty good about understanding that with those people that breed rabbits. But we largely overlook that, and probably because we just don't understand what's going on in these birds. A topic that I deal with in the second freedom is freedom from disease. How do we keep these animals healthy? Well, we need adequate veterinary information. Do we have that? No. Are we working on it? Yes. We've seen a huge advancement in avian veterinary medicine. We've seen an advancement in the number of research and publications. We've seen a lot more specialized avian practices, veterinary hospitals that focus on caring for and working with birds. And we've seen a larger interest, although it seems to be on the decline the last few years, in veterinarians who choose to have a focus on birds, that actually go through the process of getting board certified as an avian specialist. But what's unfortunate of that, and I don't do a lot of statistics, but we know some of the statistics from the demographic studies, only about 12% of bird owners actually go to the vet. And of those, there's a lack of willingness to spend money on birds. And when you look at this data compared to dogs and cats, it's harrowing. When a person will spend an average of $87 on a dog, when they look at it statistically, that same value is about $2 on a bird. And it's a huge difference in how far money will go and what we can do. The biggest problem, and the one that I deal with most, and probably the number one thing that I hate, is when people come in and they seek out veterinary care when it's too late. It's too late to help that animal. There is no way that we can do that. It is too far gone. As Clifford mentioned, it started way back. It started back in the egg. It started with its parents. It started with its parents' parents. But when we're dealing with the seeking out for medical care, we're talking about people that come in when it's too late to help them. I hate when I meet a new client and a new bird only to have it die shortly after, but it's an unfortunate part of it. It's number one of number two worst thing is that we still see birds die or are euthanized for preventable disease. This is probably a bigger issue for reptiles when we're looking at, for example, metabolic bone disease that was mentioned. When we have preventable conditions that a little bit of education and the right care could prevent, yet we have somebody who hasn't done that. My big example with that is when I see people lose birds to issues related to egg binding or issues related to reproductive problems like that, where had they just come in 6 months earlier to ask me about it, we may have been able to do something to stop that bird's egg laying, so it's now coming in shock and dying because there's an egg lodge that it can't lay. We might have been able to do something about that. We're seriously lacking in some of that preventive medical care, and that's what we need. We need people to go for routine veterinary care. We need them to have that responsibility that a pet owner has. Take it to the vet, have an annual checkup, be willing to spend money when they're sick, and be willing to allow that relationship to develop. You know, when people ask me, well, why do I need to bring my pet in every year? It's doing fine, it's healthy. Well, it allows you to develop that relationship. If you're a pet owner, you want a relationship with a veterinarian, with veterinary technicians, with boarding facilities, with specialty stores. Develop those relationships because it also allows me the opportunity to help you care for that bird just a bit better. It's basically their responsibilities as a pet owner. The third one is freedom from discomfort. You know, we take animals and we forget that they're not mini humans, and this was mentioned earlier as well. There's a failure on people as pet owners when they take an exotic pet. They lose sight of the fact that that animal is not just something that fits into their lifestyle. It's not comfortable where they have the air conditioner set. It's not comfortable at the humidity that they like or don't like. It's not that it should just be eating the diet they eat. There's sort of this misinformation that happens where people forget about that and they ignore the fact that that animal's environmental needs are very unique and very specific and very difficult to replicate in captivity. A lot of people have used this famous quote when looking at, you know, birds caging. The only suitable size cage is when a bird doesn't know it's in a cage. There's no cage big enough. I hate when people ask me, what is the minimum size cage I need to get for this bird? What is the maximum size? There's no answer for that. They fly for hundreds of miles. I don't know what to tell you. You live in a studio apartment. Get the biggest that you have room for, you know. What would be the solution to that? Right. It would be ideal if people would have a bird room. It would be nice if people understood the environmental needs. I have to tell people, you have dehumidifiers in a room with an animal that needs a high humidity, and then you wonder why it's sick. How do we provide the right kind of environment? How do we make sure that they get out of cage time? How do we make sure that we do it? Now, these are practical solutions of what we expect people to be able to do. They're not always followed, but we have advice when it comes through. Freedom from fear. I mean, avoiding mental suffering is very difficult. We have to rely on the physical expression of certain behaviors that we then recognize indicate that that animal is experiencing stress. Social relationships are critical to survival. What do we see as a result of that? And I'll touch on it in a little bit. Self-trauma, self-injury, issues related to feeling so much stress in captivity that we don't prevent trauma. We don't provide safety. We don't keep the concept of predation away. We don't remove those stressors from these birds, and we don't give them what they need. There are certain species of birds that prefer to sleep in nests, yet their cage is just an empty cage. People think, oh, they sleep on a perch. They're completely unaware that there are certain birds that would prefer a dark, quiet space. There are certain birds that live in a nest all the time. They don't only build a nest to lay eggs, and we're denying some of these basic fundamental traits that these animals need in order to do well. And probably the fifth freedom is the biggest one that we just can't give pet birds, the freedom to carry out all those normal behaviors that we've touched on. In the wild, like this picture of these Patagonian conures, birds spend a lot of their day flying and foraging and interacting with their flock. The bulk of the day is spent seeking out food. The bulk of the day is spent moving around. During breeding seasons, time is spent nesting, rearing chicks, procuring food to raise those chicks, interacting with other members of the large social flocks. This is probably the biggest thing we do wrong, the single bird household, the single parrot home where that animal never sees another bird. And what happens when they do? Well, in the wild, they live like this. But what happens in someone's home? They decide to bring another one in, and they don't get along, and they fight. And the first thing the bird does is attack the other bird. We see a huge amount of aggression in an animal that should be able to live in a large flock type of situation. You know, what are some of the solutions to dealing with that? Well, certainly it would be nice if we never deflighted birds. It'd be nice if we had social interactions that were beyond just the owner. Can we provide an environment where these birds can socialize with other birds? How do we get them out of their cage? How can we set up the right type of environment to give them food and toys and foraging activities? There's been a move now for a number of bird toy companies to start developing foraging toys, ways to entertain your bird, ways to give them something to do. They're great short-term solutions. They're great because birds figure them out and become bored with them, and somebody feels like they just spent $35 for a toy. The bird better play with it for 4 years. Well, the bird's done with it in 2 weeks, you know. So we need to think along those lines. But looking through the concept of these 5 freedoms, how can we provide that for captive animals? Well, we have a difficult time doing that. And using the term again, this is really the crux of what we're talking about. We're looking at changing this paradigm. Experience over the last few decades is forcing us to reevaluate these issues. We have to look at what we're doing and what we're not doing for animals. And like I said, my focus is on pets because that's what I deal with and what I do, but we're talking about zoos, sanctuaries, shelters, any place we keep animals, and most importantly, in people's homes. We have to raise that bar. We have to redefine what's accepted standards of care for captive birds. Like I mentioned earlier, there was a time where birds were fed peanuts. People thought that's what you did. You went to the pet store, you got an Amazon parrot, and its diet was peanuts, and the bird lived 4 years. So we've redefined some of that. We know better. We're not making some of the same mistakes, but we're making a battery of new ones the more we continue to increase keeping these animals as pets. One of the important things, and certainly animal shelters and care facilities, but all of us, rescue organizations, veterinary professionals, we all need to be educated. Well, what are we educating ourselves with? A body of information that largely is in the process of being determined. We don't have a lot of that information. Veterinary medicine has its challenges. We often joke that we're 10 years behind human medicine, and then my joke is avian medicine then falls 10 years behind dog and cat medicine. So we all need to be educated on new standards of avian welfare. What are these new standards? Probably along the lines of determining whether what we've talked about, should these animals even be kept as pets, and then shifting to the fact that, well, we all agree it's probably no, but they're here and they're here to stay, and we're not going to stop that. So how are we going to work towards doing that? Well, the reality of dealing with pet birds now more on a personal level is a lot of people have unrealistic expectations of what happens when they take that bird in. We have high relinquishment rates with pet birds. It's said now that the average bird is kept about 3 years in someone's home before they rehome it, before they put it on Craigslist to sell it, or before they actually try to find a sanctuary that's willing to take it. There have been a huge expanse in sanctuaries, everything from large-scale sanctuaries to somebody just turning a basement into a bird sanctuary. More and more people are willing to take in unwanted birds, probably beyond their capacity, but then we see an issue with them getting full. There's only so many they can take as well. And so people will sometimes say, I can no longer keep my bird, what can I do with it? Well, I can provide them with resources, but then they come back to me and say, I tried those 3 sanctuaries and they all said they have no room. Now what? So a lot of these sanctuaries are filling up. So we have more birds coming in, more birds being kidnapped and brought in for sale, and no place for them to go when people don't want them. The biggest complaints that people have about pet birds, messiness, and then the second one is going to be noisiness. This is the 2 things that grate on people that are the reasons why they no longer want to keep those pets. And certainly incessant screaming is what leads to neglect and abuse. This is what leads to people kind of crossing the line. There's only so much they can tolerate when they're trying to have quiet time, and the bird is just calling. They don't understand the behavior, they don't understand the biology, they just see it as a nuisance. It's not something they thought was going to happen. That cute little baby bird didn't do it, and now that it's reached puberty and now that it's ignored in another room, it's calling out, it's looking for its flock. Well, we don't see it that way. People decide, I just can't take that noise, it's got to go. For those of you who haven't seen this, I implore you to watch it. Probably most of you have seen it. It's a great little film. It's another baby step. We're all taking baby steps here. But it's really an interesting take on it. It's one of the first really in-our-face bird movies that's really having people start re-examining whether we should be keeping these animals in captivity or not. I think it's a really important part of advancing what we're doing is getting people to see things like this. So please watch it. If you are so inclined, the producers of this film, who I went to a lecture and met them and listened to a talk they gave, are happy to have Parrot Confidential parties. They're happy to release viewing. They want people to see this and look at it and view it and understand it and sort of let it in. Of course, when we look at parrot relinquishment, we're looking at certain excuses or certain changes that occur. It's not always the bird's fault. We have to consider a lot of these. These are a lot of what I hear. Certainly a number of them don't sit right with me. One of the big ones living in New York City is when a client says, I just moved into a no-pet building from my pet building and I don't want my pet anymore. And I said, well, I don't understand, because there are lots of buildings that allow pets. You're living in one right now. How do you have pets and then make the choice to move? Do you move to a no-children building when you have kids? People just don't think that way. And it's funny because it's so easy. And the bottom line is, we've made a situation, and I guess I should probably speak more for demographically, but we've made a situation where pets are disposable. It's very easy. If you don't want it, you can get rid of it. There's one way or another. And that goes up to and includes, I don't want it anymore, I can't deal with it, euthanize it. So you're giving me a healthy animal that there's nothing wrong with it. It's just the fact that you've now moved into a no-pet building and you want me to euthanize this pet because there's no place else for it to go. Well, that makes things even harder for me. So a lot of different excuses. I think the last one is probably the only valid one, when somebody has that as a reason why they can no longer keep their pet. Interestingly, that's a real common problem with longevity. And shifting a little bit about parrot relinquishment, but what are the signs of stress? What are the symptoms that people need to recognize in these birds that indicate they're not healthy, they're not well, they're not adapting, they don't like it? These are a lot of the biggest reasons why people relinquish their birds, why they don't want to keep them. And it's hard to understand what's really going on, because certainly when somebody complains that the bird is too noisy and now is suddenly too quiet, they look at that as a positive thing. But it's not necessarily indicating that that animal is happier because it's being more quiet. Any of the issues that develop with self-destructive behavior certainly are indicating something is wrong. We know that feather-destructive behavior is a disease of captivity. It's a problem that happens because we are not allowing these animals to act out on their behavioral needs. And certainly any of the other stereotypic behaviors, this is an area where fortunately there's been a growing interest because of stereotypic behavior in zoo animals. We've had a lot of people who have developed more of an interest in that. It's led to a bit more about how we need to think about enriching the environments. Somebody recently told me that it's probably not a polar bear in a zoo anywhere in this world that's not on buckets of Prozac to try to keep it from pacing its enclosure. It's just something that happens when they're in environments. It's along the lines of what we've already talked about with those reptiles and those rostral lesions from rubbing and pacing back and forth. And I treat a lot of those, and I'm faced with the question is, what can I do about that? And the problem is probably not have them, but secondary to that is what can we do to minimize stress? What are we going to go through? Some of the slides are a bit wordy. I'm not going to certainly mention everything, but considerations of what we think are going to be most appropriate. A common one that people often talk about is, I thought it'd be more fun. I put my bird's cage right up against the window. Well, the window looks out on a busy street, a lot of activity. A lot of birds don't like that. That doesn't make it more fun for them. The owner thinks it's more fun for them to get to look out the window and watch what's going on, but oftentimes that's not the best place to put a bird cage. So we have to consider where in the home they live, where the cage is placed, how are they away from dangers, what's going to give them the sort of most peace of mind in where they live, because we know birds are agitated by a lot of things, loud noises, strangers, changes. There's a unique phenomenon with a lot of pet birds where there tends to be a certain device that they hate. And that's one of the few times we use the term hate, because there are a lot of birds that hate cell phones. And as soon as they see it, they need to kill it. There's no exception to that. There are birds that develop these sort of weird angers towards soda cans or any number of different inanimate objects. There are issues with the owner wearing a hat. There are issues with the owner wearing a certain shade of lipstick. There are these type of things that we have to recognize that these birds are very sensitive to, and we have to think about minimizing stress on these animals in captivity. Enrichment certainly has been one of those. Opportunities for socialization, opportunities for them to be able to bathe properly, for them to get the right amount of exercise, to give them games, to play music. A lot of my clients believe their birds are happier if they leave cartoons on for them to watch, and I don't know if it's maybe just the sort of the activity on the TV or the movement or something. I don't think that that's the excuse to make it better to keep that animal if putting it in front of the TV for 8 hours of the day is what entertains it, but I guess that's sort of become the new babysitter for humans as well. But it's sort of another method of thinking about how we're minimizing stress and how we're going to provide for these animals. Things to do, things to chew on, things to destroy, things to break. The cockatoo owners that buy 2x4s and slide those in the cage because the bird could spend the day working at turning that into a pile of sawdust. It helps at least give them something to do. This little cartoon here, I don't know if you can read it, but it sort of gets into that whole sort of age-old Polly wants a cracker, and basically that this bird has escaped and he wants to know where he can get a cracker, and he's asking the local pigeons. But it touches on what we've always thought are the stereotypes of these birds. We've always thought that that's been a simple explanation for them. Socialization minimizes stress in captive birds. They're flock animals. They want to be around other birds. Even if they can't live with other birds, they should be around them. They should be able to see them, watch them, look at them. I often tell clients if they're interested in getting another bird, if it doesn't work out for the birds to live together, even if they're roommates and not bonded, at least have the cage next to each other. At least have the presence of another bird. It does make a difference for a lot of these animals. I already alluded to before how some of these birds that would live in normally large flocks and live in large social groups seem to be unable to live with even another of their kind, and we're not sure why that happens. What works better are people that keep two birds or 3 birds in the home, and those birds move in together. And this is a common scenario that happens. Eventually, the birds will choose to accept each other. They may be 2 completely different species. I've seen the extremes of where the budgie lives with the macaw. I've seen the extremes out of desperation where these birds are moving in with other animals. This is sort of a popular thing that mainstream people think it's really cute. They love the idea of these interspecies relationships. I'm always that person that anytime I see them, I hate them. I think that it's a form of desperation. And yes, it's cute that your cockatiel lives with your guinea pig, but it's sad that they're each alone. And it's some reaching out attempt to try to find others and to try to have that relationship. And I guess the bottom line is what are we saying here? Some things in life are really meant to be free. Some things are just not meant to be existing in our homes. And I circle around back to that, and then we kind of switch back to a little bit more about what can we do to prepare people. Because when people come and ask me, and I was just talking about this in the break, you know, I'm an exotic pet veterinarian. My practice is limited to all pets except dogs and cats. And I have people all the time that contact me that ask for advice about what type of pets to get. And I get calls and requests from everybody with everything. What type of primate do you suggest I get? Well, of course, never. You know, more than probably anything else. But we really want a monkey. We think it'd be great. And okay, well then we want a lemur, or you want something else that's just purely a wild animal. But people come through and they want to adopt a bird and they want to know what to get. And you know, if I have to make those answers, then at least I can come up with some information for them. But at least I have people consider before they adopt and when they get into it, please consider a few things. What we already know about birds, I'm not going to read the list, but we know they're difficult. We know they're messy. We know they scream. They make noise. They can bite. They need a lot. They need a lot of attention. They need a lot of care. They need expensive cages. They need a varied diet. They need you to do a lot more. We've minimized what we think is a simple way to care for a dog or cat. They get a cup of their dry kibble and they're good for the day. You know, it doesn't go any further than that. Of course, a lot of people are starting to rethink that whole thing as well, and that may become a big movement, but it's a bit more complex when we're talking about keeping a parrot. It's not that simple. Now, granted, most of them do exist that way. I think the most common diet of a lot of the birds I see is a commercially available seed mix, and then it ranges from pizza crust, bagels, pretzels, potato chips, crackers, anything like that, and then a few other foods. A high amount of meat fed to captive parrots as well. For whatever reason, they seem to like buffalo chicken wings. So people learn this, and it becomes a big part of the bulk of the diet, and a lot of it is just what they're sharing. Of course, a big aspect of it is the expense of keeping that pet. Not only veterinary expenses, but the ongoing expense of keeping a bird. And then you look at the challenges of keeping them. Of course, this is the biggest challenge. You know, they're unpredictable. And one of the things that people forget is they are wild. And there's no way you can convince them otherwise. They're wild animals. They may not do everything you expect. They may have huge behavior changes. You may find that it becomes very difficult to try to care for them. You may find that they reach a certain age, and this is something I deal with all the time, where they now don't like you. They don't like someone in your house. They don't like your husband or wife. They don't want the neighbors to come and visit. It becomes a huge problem. And people need to be prepared for this. And there's no way to ever get anybody equipped to understand every challenge they may have, that based on that individual, it's going to be a huge challenge for them to be able to keep that pet long term. And that's unfortunate. I was at a seminar recently. I gave a lecture at a veterinary school, and one of the other presenters talked about the myths of keeping parrots. And she works as an adoption coordinator at a large sanctuary that takes in a lot of birds, but also tries to rehome those birds, but puts a huge focus on making sure that when they do rehome a bird, it's into a permanent home, or it's into the right home. And her lecture was presenting these 10 myths about keeping birds. And once again, I'm not going to read the entire list. But some of the things we should understand is there is no perfect parrot. There is no ideal keeping the single parrot. It's not a simple diet. It's all of the things we've talked about so far, that it's not just going to be a simple pet that you buy a cage and you buy some bird food and that's it, you get to enjoy them. The concepts of thinking that these birds don't need routine care, that they don't need flight, that they don't need socialization, that it's easy to take them with you. I mean, this is something that people come up with all the time. I want to take my parrot outside. Well, it's going to fly away. You know, I mean, it's not that simple. It doesn't work that way. So we need to consider that there are a lot of myths about keeping these birds as well, and we need to try to dispel these in some ways to get people to rethink what they're doing. Now, a little bit about what we've heard already too, pet stores, and where people are procuring these animals. There's basically three ways that people get a bird. They either go to the pet store and they buy it, and one good thing that's happened, and I don't know where else this is happening, but I know that in New York, there was a question about what's happening, baby steps. Pet stores cannot sell birds larger than a conure. So they're no longer allowed to sell any of the large parrots, which was a huge blessing, probably one of the best things that could happen. And I was mentioning as well, side note, as of 2 weeks ago, pet stores in New York City can no longer sell rabbits. And we have a huge problem with rabbits. The shelters are so full of rabbits, I can't spay and neuter rabbits fast enough to even make a dent in what's happening. Every foster home has 10. Everybody that's taking in rabbits. So we've now passed legislation that makes it illegal for pet stores to sell rabbits. You want a rabbit, you go to the shelter and get one. It's great, it's fantastic. It's a wonderful thing that's happened. I hope it sets the tone for other issues. But we're dealing with the issue here of where most people get most of their exotic pets. They're going to a pet store. It's the easiest, most convenient place to get them. Like we've mentioned earlier today as well, they can get that whole kit. Most of the time you can get the pet free if you buy the kit. If you buy the cage for your new parakeet, it comes with a free bird. You've basically spent that money. If you buy the entire setup for the gerbil, they'll throw in the gerbil for free because you bought the tank and the food and the wheel and everything you need. So when we're dealing with pet stores, of course, it's a thorn in most of our sides because they don't provide the right information and the right type of care. Spend any time in a pet store about something you know about and listen to the pet store counsel people and talk to people. It's some of the most harrowing experiences I have when I go into a pet store and I overhear a conversation of the pet store employee trying to tell somebody how to take care of that pet. Or even better, and I laugh because I don't want to cry, is even better telling them, answering their questions about pet care and telling them something's okay. I recently heard somebody in a pet store indicating that their rabbit would only eat Cheerios. That was the only thing they could get the rabbit to eat. The pet store person basically said, that's probably okay because it's not that different than rabbit food. Well, that person went home and is now, right, exactly, right. So that kind of fits, right, exactly. But the pet stores are not equipping people with the right information, and people aren't seeking that information out. This is another thing that I've always dealt with personally, and it's just me. Whenever I considered getting a new pet over my lifetime, and I've had everything, and I've owned everything, and I've tried everything, and I've had everything live with me, I learn about it before I get it. I buy a book, I do research, I go online, I talk to people, I talk to breeders. I go above and beyond to learn everything I need to know, and then I get ready to take that animal in. Well, that seems to be the reverse of what most people do, especially with exotic pets. They didn't even plan to get one that day. They were out grocery shopping, and they happened to walk in the pet store because they saw something, and they came home with a Uromastix, and they don't know anything about it. They don't even know how to spell it. They don't know where it comes from. They don't even know what they're going to do, and the pet store told them, well, here, just feed it this, and that's all they need to do, and that's all they think they need to do. So. People don't know a lot about birds going into it. They don't understand it. Of course, they have to learn at some point, but they're just not aware of what's going to happen. And further, pet shops have this move to want to sell unweaned birds. Same thing with breeders and same thing with the large bird specialty stores. That has been the crux of what they've done in the industry. They believe that's the best time to get that bird to bond with you. They want to send these birds home. Now this is a person who has never had a bird, never owned a bird, knows nothing about them, and is now being told its entire survival is based on your ability to pump it full of this liquid food that they don't even know what they're doing. I still have to take out feeding cannulas from crops from people that don't understand that the bird can swallow that when they're feeding them. Aspiration, pneumonias, issues with that. But the pet store's belief is sell them while they're young. That's what's going to allow people to bond the best with them. And they get a 3-minute demonstration on how to keep that bird alive with feeding it a formula. We still see crop burns. We still see issues with the mistakes that people make with that. All preventable conditions, if we could do something about that. Certainly the problems in pet stores, we're all aware of it. Overcrowding, improper diets, constrictive cages, poor dissemination of information, poor care sheets, sale of unweaned birds, sale of damaged goods already becomes a real problem. And how do we promote some of the welfare with this? Well, these are probably some of the biggest obstacles we're ever going to have to go through. Enacting laws that require humane care of animals in pet stores. Well, it sounds like a no-brainer. It doesn't happen, but it would certainly be nice. Ensuring that pet shops include birds as their protected animals. Wow, imagine that. They're selling them. They have a whole room full of them. Wouldn't that be nice if they actually had to consider them protected the way they would other animals? And certainly other things, requiring them to feed them correctly, clean them correctly, use proper disinfectants, isolate them, quarantine, anything they can do to try to raise the standard of what they're putting out into the population would certainly be ideal. Certainly it would be nice if we could prohibit them from selling unweaned animals, but that unfortunately doesn't seem to happen. Certainly it'd be nice if we had some regulation on breeding. I don't necessarily know how things are here in Canada, but it seems to be free will. Get a boy and a girl, put them together, and you're a breeder. You know, it's that simple. Anybody can do it with any animal anytime they want, and nobody's going to say anything. And they can set up a website, and they could sell those baby animals to anybody they want, and anybody that wants can buy them. Clifford was talking about that horrific situation with those pet stores in Texas. And we joke about Texas is the place where you can get anything. You want a tiger? There's somebody selling them in Texas. You want a rare flying fruit bat? You can get them in Texas. You know, it's so easy to get any kind of animal that it's few and far between when we hear about that person keeping that alligator in their bathtub in the Bronx, or we hear about that person that's mauled by the pet chimpanzee that they bought on Craigslist. So it's really a problem, and promoting better welfare is going to come about through legislation, through laws, but it's really only going to come about through people caring, people developing more of an interest, and people actually going through the steps it takes to promote better welfare. The Avian Welfare Coalition has a very simplified 5 F's for better bird welfare, as they call it. Fresh food, flight, fun, flock living, and freshen up. So these 5 F's are 5 simple things that we can tell somebody to do. What can I do better to take care of my bird? I don't think it's happy. Well, look towards the 5 F's. Of course, you can explain a bit more about each of those, but once again, this is promoting better welfare. Whatever diet you're feeding, do better. Whatever environment they're in, improve it. Whatever toys they have, change them all out for new and better ones. Raise the standard of what you want to do for that pet. And of course that leads to certain issues about what has been the industry norms. Social isolation has been proven in numerous studies and in numerous types of animals to be so psychologically damaging to animals, yet we keep a lot of these animals alone. We recently had a veterinary technician come and spend a month with us on her own time because she wanted to learn about exotic pets from Sweden. And I didn't realize that in Sweden, it's actually the law that you have to keep a minimum of 2 of any pet that can coexist, which I think is brilliant and amazing. You don't get to just have 1 rabbit, 1 guinea pig, 1 ferret. You have to have a minimum of 2 because those animals need to be with others of their kind. And I thought that was really great. If you look back at the old studies where people looked at social deprivation in primates, and we found what a nightmare it was to have these baby primates raised without parents. We've seen the same thing happen, and the same thing happens with birds. The goal now is to raise that bird from as close to the egg as possible. It never sees another bird. It's not raised by it. There's been a movement to co-raise baby birds. Some of the breeders out there have actually learned that if they co-raise those baby birds with the parents, they're producing a better quality bird. Part of that has come from the high rates of certain macaws that develop feather-destructive behavior, that we found that early childhood rearing is the biggest factor in preventing unwanted behaviors. So the other rule that birds are fine in a cage is another thing we need to think outside the cage for. The concept that they need to just come out for exercise and go back in the cage. The cage should be a place where birds retreat when someone's away. They should be for safety. They should be where they eat. And ideally, if you have birds that are potty trained, that only poop in the cage, they go back to the cage to poop, and then they can go back to where they want to be. It's a system of safety. It's important for shelter, but it needs to not be looked at as the entire space that the bird needs to live in. That's not that bird's whole world, is that little cage that they stay in. There are certain recommended minimum standards of what we would like, but we'd ideally like a total living environment for these birds. What about this? What about the concept of having a bird room? What about having a large area where the bird doesn't have to stay confined? What about the person that's willing to go the extra mile and convert their entire garage into a bird area? They're certainly going to be able to provide a lot better for these animals. this may be going to the other extreme with the amount of toys and decorations they have, but they've dedicated a large enough space to have a huge cage. They've got plants in there, they've got a natural environment, there's windows, there's lighting, or an entire room in the home that's dedicated to this. And I know a lot of people not living in New York City, but out of the city that will designate an entire room, and they'll have tree stands and ropes hanging from the ceiling, and they'll set up a really ideal environment for these birds to live in. And it's really quite rewarding and refreshing. Of course, this is probably one of the better things to do if you're willing to go forward with it. A great solution is an outdoor porch type environment. I think if I were going to keep large parrots, which I never will, but if I were going to, this is probably one of the things you'd have to consider doing. Can I set up something like that, or an indoor-outdoor aviary? It provides everything that the bird needs as best as we can in captivity, but also allows us to keep them as pets. It also allows us to keep that enjoyment factor in there. And so people that are able to actually set up an aviary type situation to keep these birds in, we're probably going to find that's the most beneficial and erring on the side of the most positive welfare for keeping these pet birds. The opposite of that, as you saw some pictures before, is the extremes of keeping them in small cages where they never come out, and the first time they bite somebody is the last time they come out of that cage for the rest of their lives. So birds fly. Like we said before, it's what they do. It's what makes a bird. It's what they're supposed to do. It's fundamentally important. Social well-being, mental well-being, health. It's really their only form of exercise. And if their wings are always clipped and they don't get to do anything but step up on someone's shoulder or walk around the floor, they're not getting adequate exercise. I have new clients that will come in sometimes with a pet bird, and at the end of the exam they'll ask, oh, why didn't you clip its wings? As if that was something that I would automatically do. And I said, well, why would we do that? Don't you want your bird to fly? And they say, well, yes, but every veterinarian I've ever been to has always clipped the wings. I thought that's just what you do. Well, there are still avian vets out there that just do that automatically. It's what you do. Part of that bird's checkup is cut off its wings. And if I can do the opposite, which is to encourage them to not do that and encourage the bird to fly, certainly that's definitely a more positive thing for their welfare. Of course, we have to consider dangers. There are certain situations where a bird flying puts them at greater risk of being harmed, and we need owners to pay attention to that. We need them to be aware that that's not necessarily the right way to go with it. All pets need training. Birds are certainly no exception. I think the important thing for people to realize that time spent training is social enrichment. It improves the welfare of keeping these birds. The time you spend doing anything from teaching them to roller skate or teaching them to play bird basketball, or even just the interactions, but just teaching, training, voice commands, having them do something in response to a command, it just helps further the bond. People talk about working dogs. Dogs that have a job live longer. That's one of the things that people have found. So when they have something to do, they tend to do better. And we're going to definitely deal with less problems once we have a bird that's better trained. I know for me, when people come in with a bird that's well trained, they have a much better experience coming to the vet. Those birds that are not handled, it's horrible for them to go through what we have to do. I sometimes call it the King Kong and Fay Ray type of thing, because here I'm this giant person and I'm reaching in a cage and I'm taking this little bird out that's normally never touched and never leaves the cage and never has any social interaction. Well, if you can imagine, it's probably the worst 20 minutes of that bird's life that year. It's a necessary evil, but people who train and socialize and put effort into getting their birds desensitized are going to have a better outcome in the long run. Certainly this is a factor to consider, taking vacations, not to spend a lot of time on it, but people who have pet birds have to understand that they can't travel with those birds without getting a health certificate. If they want to do international travel, it's even more involved, and the standards have actually been raised, especially with issues with avian influenza and issues with the concern with certain diseases that we've seen in the past in Southeast Asia. A lot of times if people want to take their birds somewhere, they have to go through a series of steps, including medications, parasite treatments, certain specific tests based on what that country requires. It's quite involved, and it takes a lot more than people are aware of what they need. And then lastly, estate planning. You know, this is something people have to consider. A lot of these birds will outlive the owners. And so there are steps in effect for people to do what they need to do. There are lawyers that specialize in caring for birds in people's wills. There are things that people need to do to take steps to make sure that their birds, I guess the same thing they do for their children, their family members, and any other pets in the untimely event, definitely planning is something that's more useful for these birds. So to switch gears a little bit, I just want to touch briefly on some issues related to conservation and unfortunately what we see happening in the real world today. The wildlife trafficking industry, the global illegal pet trade, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are people who say it's second only to the illegal drug trafficking industry, and how lucrative and how valuable and how relevant it really has become. And unfortunately, when we're looking at this, and I guess depending on your source, birds are probably one of the most popular sought after exotic animals. They're one of the most desired, and thus supply and demand mean more people are going to go out and steal babies from nests and try to capture these birds in the wild. And as a result, about a third to almost a half of the world's parrot species are now threatened or endangered. And the combined pressures of attempting to take them from the wild have led to habitat loss, destruction of the natural world. Unfortunately, the trade in wild parrots is driven by the market that is really profit-oriented. Of course, anything illegal is all about money, and anything illegal tends to result in even more money. Unfortunately, the other part of it is the sad truth that a lot of these birds come from areas where human poverty is at its highest. A lot of these birds happen to be coming from third world countries and third world areas where people in those places are starving, have nothing else, and sometimes they look at this as their only commodity. You know, unfortunately, a big factor in where these birds come from is the social acceptability of selling these birds to people. I had mentioned I have a friend who works in conservation who's in Honduras right now. A lot of times these birds are coming from villages where this is the only source of income. The only way these people are going to buy food is if they kidnap and sell these birds. And they live in villages where there's no electricity, there's no running water, there's no plumbing. And somebody gets a moped and they drive 5 hours through the rainforest to deliver these birds to the airport to get money to buy rice and beans so that some of the people in the town can eat. It's a real serious factor when our focus is on avian welfare, but the global issue is the welfare of all of us that are on this planet. The countries with the high demand for legal wildlife are interestingly the ones that want the illegal wildlife. The United States, the People's Republic of China, no offense, but of course that's a huge nightmare with what happens with the illegal trafficking in China, and then certain members of the EU. Combined with no law enforcement. Kidnapping of these birds occurs in the middle of the rainforest. There doesn't happen to be a local police station. There's nobody you can call. There's nobody that will enforce that. And when they come in, you know, the local authorities are the cousins of the villagers. They're not going to arrest their Aunt Mildred for climbing a tree and kidnapping a baby bird because she needs to feed her family. So it's a more of a deeper issue than that. Of course, the decline in wild populations is directly attributable to the desire to get these birds in people's homes, and that's the sad part of it. The 1992 Wild Bird Conservation Act certainly has helped. We've known that some of these have made dents, but the United States passed it, but a lot of other countries still allow the trafficking, still allow the import and export of wild birds, and a significant number of the captive parrots in homes were wild caught. We've done our best to try to control that. We really try to make sure that domestically bred birds wear bands and have proof that they were bred, but we still see a lot of these birds getting into it. And unfortunately, they've suffered devastating depletion of their populations. I mentioned some of the South American or Central American countries are having 98% poaching rates. It's going to drastically affect what happens in the next 20 years. Combined with habitat destruction, combined with human development, rainforest deforestation really does still happen. We're putting numerous species at risk. Not only birds, but all kinds of animals are disappearing. It's said that animals are going extinct before we even discover them, and that's an unfortunate aspect of what we're seeing. Unfortunately, bird trade and possession aren't being affected by the current legislation. This is a huge area that we need to work towards. How can we get a bit more protection? As I mentioned earlier, captive breeding was theorized to be the way we were going to solve this problem. Well, unfortunately, we know they're still not domesticated. People want us to believe that, oh, I breed these in captivity, they're domesticated pets. It just doesn't work that way. And unfortunately, the role of private breeders has largely become profits and money. It's largely become breeding outside of conservation plans. It's largely become, how do I provide birds for the pet trade without a concern for what happens in the natural world? Breeding in captivity does nothing to help conservation efforts. It does very little to help wild populations. Even in zoos where we have controlled breeding, we have species survival programs, we have attempts to do that, it's not making as big a dent as illegal poaching is in the opposite direction, and that's unfortunate. The majority of a lot of these animals that are bred in captivity don't find their way out to the wild. It just doesn't work that way. There's an initiative in Costa Rica now, Hatch to Fly Free, where they're trying to get these birds reacclimated to what it is to be a wild bird and then release those birds back into the wild whenever it's possible. Birds that are kidnapped, birds that are living in places where they are caught at the borders, where people are trying to smuggle them out. You've all seen or heard some of these stories about people taping baby birds to themselves or trying to smuggle eggs out of countries. There are entire zoos filled with animals that are found in suitcases and luggage and taped to people's bodies as people are trying to leave these countries. We need to start trying to figure out how we can do something about that. Certainly in captivity, the concept of adaptation isn't really there. Successful adaptation, it's a relative term because by definition, all of the captive situations we provide for birds really are too stressful. They exceed what we can do, and they just don't match the free living environment at all. And probably, a bit redundant in that, but unfortunately, the biggest mistake that we have is we remove the concept of what we call free will. It's widely known that captivity prevents what people believe to be one of the biggest factors in all of our health and well-being, and that's the concept of agency or having free will. The concept of being able to make decisions and choices on our own. You don't get to make those. We've seen the reptiles don't get to do that in captivity. Most of the other animals don't as well. And then we deal with the situation where we completely block the concept of free will in captivity. We force an animal to be what we want. We force it to do what we want. We want to make a nocturnal animal awake during the day. We want to feed them exactly what we want. And we lose sight of that, and it sets up for a much worse situation. So what would be nice is if we actually did this. If we actually could get to the point where we replace the demand for birds as pets with the demand for preserving birds in the wild. Could you imagine if we just decided that there was a higher value with getting to see them in the wild than see them in our living room? If we could actually promote ecotourism, if we could actually figure out ways that local people could make money by having these birds that didn't involve selling them into the pet trade. If we allowed people to realize that there are a few things that are really as beautiful as seeing these birds in the natural world where they belong. This one slide probably says it all. I don't know that we'll see this in our lifetimes. I don't know that we'll ever see it. But if people understood the idea of what it would be like to make money on free-living wild birds, I think we could change the entire paradigm of what we do. And this kind of quote is a really good one. The rescue of one animal doesn't change the world, but for that animal, the whole world changes. And I think that's really imperative in what we're looking at trying to do here. A big part of what I've gone over now, and I'm going to kind of rush through this in the interest of time, the rest of this, but we're talking about how have we determined the suitability of a certain animal, specifically a bird. I think what we've probably done is we've shown that they're not really suitable as companion animals. We really can't meet their social needs, their biological needs. We don't understand their behavior. We don't know how to feed them. We don't know enough about their medicine. We're really just doing a disservice, and we really need to change this paradigm and either stop having them, but that's not going to happen. So we've got to raise the bar, and we've got to do all these things we've talked about. We've got to give them the right environment, the right cages, the right socialization, training, try to meet the needs of their diet. We've got to take the steps to make that happen. We can't control what everybody does, and certainly everybody has the right in their own home what they do, but however we can influence that and however we can work toward that is going to be the biggest part of what we can do. Now the second part, like I said, I'm going to go through fairly quickly. It's just a few general concepts that stem down from some of the work we've been doing in trying to train shelter employees and sanctuary employees to be able to work with birds. And some of these may be familiar to some people, but in dealing with birds, one of the trickiest things is handling them properly and working with them and physically being able to move them, to catch them, to restrain them, to when we need to do that, to be able to hold them. And there's some safe handling guidelines. Certainly practice makes perfect. If you've ever worked with pet birds, if you've ever had to restrain them, if you've ever had to handle them, if you've had to even just take them from a carrier and put them into a cage, you understand there are some unique challenges to that, including the fact that they can do serious damage to you while you attempt to do that. So one of the things to remember is birds that can fly will attempt to escape as fast as possible. They will then go to the highest place they can find. So we want to be careful where we open carriers, where we open boxes, whatever container the birds come in. I'm always amazed when a client will bring in a pet bird and they haven't purchased a proper carrier to bring it to the vet. So it comes in a shoebox or something where I have to lift an entire lid up to be able to even see the animal or to get to it. You can't just kind of blindly reach in there. But investing in a proper carrier, but understanding how we're going to be able to work with these birds is really important. Avian restraint is very tricky, it's very difficult. It's something I deal with every day, all day with the patients that I'm seeing in the hospital. Certainly one of the basic things that you want to try to do is teach people how to hold a bird properly so it won't hurt them, but they won't hold the bird. I spend a lot of time trying to teach owners how to do this, and for some reason they keep getting bitten and they just probably won't hold the birds tight enough. If you hold them securely around the head and neck, and you hold them still and you wrap your hand around the body, you effectively can hold this bird for short-term physical exam, procedures, blood collection, whatever you need to do, but you can also safely move that bird around if that bird isn't trained to just step up on your hand and be relocated. And it takes practice. I think the biggest thing that people do wrong is they're afraid to hold them tightly enough. And once you give them enough freedom to move, they certainly have movement enough to bite you. But what we can never do with birds is constrict their ability to breathe. This is how birds die when they're held and when they're restrained. This is how birds die when people try to smuggle them and kidnap them and steal them. They need to expand and contract their entire body wall to be able to breathe. Their lungs don't inflate and deflate like mammalian lungs. They don't have a diaphragm. They don't breathe the same way that mammals breathe, and the only way that you'll really kill a bird is if you suffocate it by holding it too tightly to the degree that they can't expand and contract their entire body musculature. Knock on wood, it shouldn't happen, but unfortunately it does. When people think they need to hold that bird really tightly, they don't realize they're holding it so tightly that the bird actually can't breathe, and the bird only struggles more, so they hold it even tighter, but the bird's struggle is because it can't breathe. So it comes with practice and it comes with time, and it's something that we need to learn to do. Some people like to use gloves when they're working with wild animals, dangerous animals. Certainly that's going to help if they're going to be able to bite you. But working with birds does require certainly that. General health exam, something that we require for all pet birds. Full physical exam is something that I recommend that they have every year. I recommend all pets have a checkup every year. It's very difficult to get people to bring their pet reptiles in every year. It's very difficult to get them to even consider whether they want to have other pets examined, like the tarantula. But at least with the birds, they should be getting routine veterinary care. And we can do a full physical exam. Avian medicine has advanced enough. We can do blood tests. We can do infectious disease screening. We can help them feed their birds better. We've touched a little bit about nutrition before, but the exact nutritional requirements for all the birds we keep as pets are still unknown. So what we can do is do our best. Try to meet their needs, try to feed the most premium diets, the best quality diets, a variety, fresh foods in the diet. Always make sure we have access to clean water, but try to offer the best we can to keep these birds as healthy as possible. I already mentioned before, it's sort of oversimplified, but what do they eat? You know, fruit, nuts, seeds, leaves, plants, shoots, flowering plants, nectar, pollen, insects, depending on the species, insect sap, depending on the species. And some of these animals will actually eat carrion, and they will eat dead animals, and they will consume flesh. Learning the natural diet of the type of bird you have, and then trying to meet that nutrition is going to be the best thing that we can really do for them. People tend to be really obsessed with fruit and vegetables, fruit and vegetables. You hear that all the time. Oh, I feed it seeds and fruit and vegetables. Well, fruit is probably much more important. A lot of these birds don't eat a lot of broccoli in the wild, but that tends to be what they get. But they are eating a lot of fruit in the wild. I mentioned before why they won't eat fruit once they get into somebody's home. I can't explain that, but it seems to be a huge phenomenon. One of the things we certainly have to do is learn how to recognize signs of illness. Well, it's sometimes fairly obvious. That bird is very sick. That bird is dying. Keep in mind that early signs are often missed, and I mentioned earlier in the discussion that it's my personal belief that birds are aware when something's wrong in them long before the owners know it, long before I can probably diagnose it despite any level of medical testing that I put through. And it may be something like they've got a small tumor growing on the kidney. The bird knows something's wrong. I may not find that on a CAT scan for 6 months, but the bird knows something's wrong, and they act out in a certain way. Really in-tune owners that are really bonded with their birds, that really understand them, and they really understand routines, immediately know when something's wrong. I've learned the hard way over a number of years that the customer is always right. If somebody comes in with a pet that they know really well and they think something is wrong, they're generally right. And I generally not my place to try to argue them out of that. Even if the pet looks perfectly fine to me and has a normal physical exam, there's a high likelihood something is wrong, and it's either going to show up now or it's going to manifest itself sometime in the near future. I've been burned on that one a few times in the beginning, and I tend to not try to go through that anymore. Now, there was a time in avian medicine where the bird's poop was where it was at. We used that as the entire sort of how healthy is that bird. We couldn't do anything else. We didn't do blood tests. We didn't do infectious disease screening. We had no other way of determining health in birds except to look at their droppings, and we based everything on that. Well, certainly we know that's not the case anymore. And I would implore anybody that has birds that sees a veterinarian that checks their poop and then tells them whether that bird is healthy or not based on whatever they've looked at, they probably need to think about finding a different vet because they're missing something in those situations. We know what normal bird poop should look like, what it should be like, and when there's a problem, we know when it's time for medical care. Now, one of the things we deal with a lot, specifically with pet birds, are the issues relating to emergency situations versus what I call urgent situations. What are the true emergencies versus what are the urgent situations that people deal with a pet bird? And these are important concepts, especially in the shelter sanctuary situation, because there may be people who don't know birds that well and they're not familiar with what they're looking at. We all know what would be considered an emergency in other animals, and certainly with birds, we're dealing with issues of inability to breathe, bleeding, extreme forms of trauma. You know that these animals need immediate medical care. Well, we also deal with a lot of urgent conditions. These animals need medical care and they need help, but it's not as pressing. They're lethargic, they're depressed, they're quiet. They're clearly telling us something is wrong, but it's not an emergency situation. And we need to learn by understanding birds when those situations are apparent and when we need to classify them based on what we need to do in our degree of getting these birds the proper care that they need. And certainly we look at situations like this x-ray of a bird with a large egg that's egg-bound versus things like skin tumors versus birds that have heavy metal poisoning because they've eaten some lead component in the environment. They present for a number of different clinical signs, and then we need to figure out how we can work through determining the best course of treatment for them. Now that goes along with to the avian-specific conditions that we deal with. There's a whole host of diseases that are unique to birds, that are unique to bird care, that are unique to bird biology that we need to be able to recognize as well. Some of them are complicated, some of them are difficult to diagnose, some of them are chronic long-term conditions, but we see them, and we see a lot of common conditions. Those we separate out from those kind of rare and unusual situations. I know people always say to me when I meet them at dinner parties, oh, you're a bird vet, what do birds get? What goes wrong with them? What are you seeing? Well, I can list a number of different general categories of what we see, and then I can list some random obscure things. I could say I'm in New York City. I see a lot of lead poisoning because we live in old buildings. I see a lot of traumatic injuries. We see a lot of different problems, but we also see those problems owing to the bird themselves. The bird is having trouble laying an egg. The bird was attacked by the family cat. We have a number of different situations, some of which are much more common. And then we have our zoonotic conditions. We have our diseases that birds share with us. We have diseases that we share with birds. And this is important for people to realize, because I'm often amazed how often people have a pet bird and they've never heard the term or completely unaware that there was anything that bird could have been harboring that could have given their sick grandmother who's getting chemotherapy that lives in the bedroom next to the bird. And so, it's an important concept. The most common zoonotic diseases from pet birds, and unfortunately these still exist. Mycobacterial infections, the infections that cause tuberculosis, we still see those in birds. I still, living in New York City, probably diagnose 2 or 3 cases of tuberculosis in pet birds a year, which is a huge concern. I just saw one 3 weeks ago, and a geriatric Amazon parrot came in with a swollen knee. The knee joint was swollen, and the bird has tuberculosis, and that's dangerous. That's zoonotic. Children, old people, immunosuppressed people. I'm left having to tell that owner their bird has what could be a potentially deadly disease that could affect them or friends or neighbors or anybody else in the environment, and they have to decide what they want to do about that. But touching on zoonotic diseases, they're another aspect of keeping pet birds. The biggest one you hear about is parrot fever. Psittacosis. People are sort of up in arms about this one. It's the one that's most often tested for. It's the one that's still looked at. I review a lot of papers for publication. Before they can get accepted for publication, I do a lot of reviews, and I help be one of the people who decides whether papers can be published or not based on scientific merit. There has been a huge influx of papers looking at this disease in foreign countries in probably the last 3 years. And whether there's a resurgence or we've just never looked for it, it's an important bacterial disease of pet birds. It's a significant disease. I don't seem to see it that much demographically where I am, but it's always been a fail-safe. Every sick bird has psittacosis. I mean, that's always been the sort of default diagnosis, but I don't think that's fair, and I don't think we see it. We can treat them. I do recommend that all new pet birds be screened for it. So anybody that gets a new pet bird at their first vet visit, we should do a chlamydia test. We should make sure the bird isn't harboring it, even if they're not showing clinical signs. And if they are, as a potentially zoonotic disease. And when I deal with nursing homes, people want to have an aviary in a nursing home. We have to make sure that we test those birds as well. We have to test them for a lot of things, but of course that's one of them. A note on fluff feathers, you hear about this a lot. My bird is fluffed, my bird is puffed. What does that really mean? Well, it could mean a number of different things, but in most cases it's an abnormal state that bird is in. When somebody says my bird is fluffed up, they're not well, something is wrong. Unless we can determine it's within the norms of preening, that it's within the norms of grooming, or that there's a huge environmental shift, chances are that the bird showing those fluffed, puffed feathers indicates something is wrong. Certainly if they're staying at the bottom of the cage, something is wrong. Birds never stay at the bottom of the cage. So if the owner says, oh, I woke up and uncovered the cage, and Peeper is sitting at the bottom of the cage, something is wrong. And then, of course, any other outward clinical signs are certainly going to be important to recognize. Supportive care of sick birds is probably the most important factor in recovery. Hopefully people get these sick birds to get the right type of care. Hopefully the type of care they're getting is the right type to meet the needs of that bird. But aggressive, intensive supportive care is probably one of the biggest factors in getting these birds to pull through almost every illness. Everything including feeding, fluid therapy, medications as appropriate, and a controlled environment, heat, anything we need to do to get these birds to get through these situations certainly is a really important factor in this. And we deal with a lot of behavioral medical conditions in birds, and these are what people tend to be more sensitive to. I know every day when I come into work and look at my schedule for the day, every time I see a new feather picking bird, I just kind of want to go home. It's a really complicated, really terrible condition that we deal with. It's very common, has a number of different causes. It's one thing when a bird will pull all its feathers out. It's another thing when a bird will mutilate itself, when they cross that line, when they don't stop. I have seen some of the most horrific cases of self-mutilation where you have to wonder at what point the animal doesn't stop doing that to itself. Why will it inflict that much damage on itself? It's the most extreme form of not keeping these animals in captivity, but they are a number of serious medical conditions that we deal with, in addition to dealing with just feather destructive behavior, FDB. These birds remove their feathers. They don't let their feathers grow. They won't keep feathers in. It's been likened to an obsessive compulsive disorder. It's written up in human psychological textbooks because these birds develop this behavior for any number of different reasons, stress being the biggest factor in it. What I think oftentimes is hormonal or reproductive stress is the reason these birds develop it. But you know, you don't like it. Nobody wants their bird to look like this. Nobody wants to have that pet bird. You know, they paid $4,000 to buy that macaw. It's supposed to have feathers, and then it reaches its sexual maturity, and suddenly it pulls all its feathers out, and it looks like this, and it's almost, how do you keep answering for that? But it's a complicated disease. It's a sad condition. It would be nice if it didn't happen. If you go to any shelter, any sanctuary, they're overrun with birds that feather pick, and whether they've been doing that their whole lives or whether it's something they developed as a result of recent stress, I guess that's a bigger part of it. You can see this macaw at the top that's pulled all its feathers out. You can also see its flight feathers are trimmed, which is probably a factor as well. Other conditions certainly we see in birds. The list can go on and on. I can talk for hours about this. We see a number of different medical conditions. One of the more interesting ones in recent years in pet birds has been conditions related to atherosclerosis and clogged arteries and lipid disorders. And we recognize them so much more often. These birds are mimicking what people do as far as getting these conditions, these cardiovascular problems. They're suffering strokes. They're suffering all of these type of problems that we see, and we have to be able to recognize and diagnose these soon enough so that we can get these birds on statin drugs is the only way to potentially keep them going, and that of course has its own whole host of problems and complications as well. Chronic beak deformities, chronic limb deformities, all of these type of developmental problems are seen. Issues relating to geriatric birds as well. The birds that are fortunate enough to make it into their sort of the golden years start dealing with arthritis. They start dealing with degeneration of their joints. You know, they deal with a whole host of other problems that become real issues that we need to deal with in captivity. Outside of what I've already mentioned, the behavioral conditions. Screaming and biting. Biting and screaming, screaming and biting, biting and screaming. I hear it 1,000 times a week. It's the two biggest concerns with keeping pet birds. I don't have an answer. I get asked, how do I stop my bird from screaming? You have to fly it back to Bolivia, I guess. There's really no great way to do that. You know, it's just not going to happen. And then, like I said, I wanted to finish up with some general tenets in the last 10 minutes on quarantine. And I think part of that is because it's largely overlooked. It's something people don't think about. The reason that quarantine started was initially when we were working through writing up a guide for shelters to work with pet birds. We found that this is something that most shelters aren't equipped to do. They don't have the room, they don't have the space, they don't have the ability, so they don't even consider it, let alone people don't consider it. I had a client recently who had 5 pet birds of her own, but she fell in love with a bird in the pet store. And so she would stop at the pet store every day on the way home from work, and she never considered that there was the potential that going to the pet store could bring something home. We never think we have to think of those things. Interestingly, she would go to the pet store, she would play with the bird, it would sit on her shoulder, she would handle it, and she never considered there would be a problem. She would go home to her birds. Well, eventually the pet store got tired of her coming in and just offered her the bird for like half price, you know, or something, just to get it out of there. No one else wanted the bird, and she was the only one visiting it. And she brings the bird home, and a week later brings it in and says, oh, we should test it. Well, it's already lived with her 5 other birds, and it tests positive for polyomavirus. And so, granted, that's probably not going to be a big deal, but it's just the fact that people don't think about quarantine. They don't think about it on the simple level. They have 2 budgies in the cage. One of the budgies passes away. They go to the pet store. They buy a new one, take it home, put it in the cage. They just don't understand the tenets of what we're dealing with. Quarantine is a term that comes from the Latin quora, 40 days. It's a period of forced isolation. It's a period of time that we take an animal that has not been exposed to others, and we try to keep them separate for an observation period to give them time to manifest disease should they have it. It's enforced restriction to prevent the spread of disease. I always try to tell my clients when they have existing pet birds, if they get another bird, they need to quarantine it for a period of time. It's very difficult. The emails start 3 days later. I feel so bad keeping this bird in the bathroom. I feel it hears the other birds, this type of thing. And I'm like, you just have to tough love through it. And they say, oh, okay, I can maybe do it for 3 weeks. And then the next email comes, I can try for 2 weeks. And then, the next thing is they send pictures of it with their other birds and they only got it 4 days ago. So, it's a period to try and both control disease spread, to limit disease spread, and zoonotic disease control as well. There are quarantine protocols that are on the biosecurity level that is just not possible for any of us to do. The most ideal situation is you have a completely separate building with a separate airspace with cages that are isolated where you don't have any potential risk of spread of disease. That's not always possible. What's also not always possible is even a separate room. What people often have to do is think about what they can do. In New York City, people in apartments, their bathroom becomes a quarantine room. A neighbor's apartment becomes a quarantine room. Any way that they can try to keep them separate. But it needs to be as separate area as possible. Separate entrance, not an area that you have to walk through, not an area that you have to move through in an attempt to try to keep your birds isolated. We have to consider not sharing. When we have birds in quarantine, you don't want to take those food bowls, water bowls, perches, and then move them around. We want to make sure that we keep what belongs in quarantine so we don't risk the transmission of disease through fomites, through inanimate objects, making sure we don't make those mistakes. Proper disinfection. This is always a big issue. There was a study or a paper that came out a number of years ago where a large-scale bird breeder used bleach to clean, and 90% of the birds died from the bleach fumes, and everybody started saying bleach is toxic to birds, you can't use bleach. But we have to make sure that we use appropriate disinfectants when we're working with these animals. And then certainly when we have birds in quarantine, we need to monitor them while they're in quarantine. We need to make sure that they're not manifesting signs of disease, that they're happy, that they're healthy, that they're eating and drinking, that they're doing everything that they normally need to do, because our goal is to make sure that when we introduce them to an existing flock, when we introduce them to a room, when we get them around other birds that we know are healthy, we've done everything we can to minimize the risk that they're going to share something. It still happens. It's a serious problem. It's a big problem in pet stores where they pay no attention to quarantine. They source out their animals from so many different breeding facilities, and then they all get mixed together. And all it takes is one to have it. It's the classic scenario like with guinea pigs. They work with 9 different breeders. You just need one guinea pig to come in with ringworm, and suddenly everyone has it. Well, they haven't recognized it, and it's already gone home, and the children have been cuddling it and playing with it and touching it, and then it becomes a bigger problem. So, the tenants can be really strict at very minimum. We know that some of these birds may harbor diseases that they may be masking. They may not show them outwardly. We need to make sure that from the time we meet them, we actually have a time period where we give them a chance to manifest those disease symptoms so we know that we do the right thing. I worked with a person who was a bird. They would get birds for people when they wanted specific types of birds. They would go to these large-scale breeding facilities. They would procure a number of different birds, and they would bring them back to them. And at the time, they gifted me a pair of starfinches. And basically, I took the birds in, and I have other birds in my home, and I put them in quarantine, and one of them died the next day, and one of them died 2 days later. And I think about all the instances where people don't quarantine, or had I not done that, I potentially could have devastated my existing flock of birds in my home. So it's largely overlooked, but you have to follow the rules, and you have to make sure you don't add new birds to quarantine. If you have a room, it stays quarantine room. If a new bird comes in, quarantine starts over. Basically making sure that we limit the likelihood. A lot of times a minimum of 30 days is the best we can do. If somebody can get a separate cage, if they can keep that bird in a separate area, if they can minimize the risk of spread. And I mean, basically, once we know that they've not shown any symptoms of infectious disease, or we've had the opportunity to have those birds tested. Now, that's the only way that I'll shorten a quarantine, is if an owner comes in and is willing to screen those birds for certain infectious diseases, and we can test them, test results come back, I've tested them negative, we should still do a quarantine, but I'm willing to start shaving off some of the days on the end of that. What we do know is it's inconvenient, it's time consuming, it takes extra work, it's harder to do, but it definitely will save the lives of birds, it will prevent others from becoming ill, and it's a good concept and it's a good protocol to set up with anything we do in any capacity of the way we're working with any animals in captivity. And that's all I have. In closing, certainly the point of all of this has been identifying some problems we have, trying to look at ways to understand what we can do better. How do we care for the ones that are already here? How do we do right by that? How can we minimize the stress on these birds? And how can we kind of raise our standards so that we can do the best for the birds that we have here in our captivity? So thank you very much, and we'll do some questions.